This one is the latest spruce Indian rosewood traditional 65 centimeter scale guitar, and it's the model I produce the most. Is fairly typical of Granada style of guitar making. It's a solid spruce top, and it's 5 fan braces with an underbridge patch without any closing bars, and it's a fairly straightforward traditional Spanish guitar. The headstock design, it's obviously my own design, and it's an interpretation of several classical design of guitars. So you can find the typical circle in the center. These motifs are also reminding flauta, for example. But other than taking these elements from historical guitars, it's designed from scratch as to be my own design with its own geometrical proportion. The same principle applies to the design of the plantilla, the shape of the box of the guitar. This also follows the same principle, so it's based on the way I could analyze from several historical guitar how they were designed by the maker, probably trying to reconstruct geometrical structures you can find starting from the lines of the box, and then after finding many elements that were repeating between different makers and among makers themselves in different models, then applying those principles to my own shape. I started from scratch, I got my shape, but it's also very traditional in the sense that it's based on design principles that you can find on many of the classical and famous historical makers like Torres, Esteso, and many others. Enrique Garcia has a lot of very interesting geometrical elements in the design of the guitar. The slopes on the channels of the head, I make them both rectangular, like this guitar, or rounded, as in several other guitars. And for my taste, since I like them both, it's only aesthetic, and it just depends. When I grow bored of seeing too many rectangles, I make them round, or I ask the customer. So sometimes the customer has a preference for one or the other, and then I make it to his specifications. Mm-hmm. One other thing about the design of the headstock is that I've been ordering since several years now custom tuning machines from Alessi in Italy, and the plate of the tuning machine has the same shape as the headstock on both ends, and the engraving it's a reminder of this motif I have on my normal Rosette. Speaking of the nut, the way I like to make it is the slots are V-shaped, not round, so the string only touches on 2 spots on both sides, on one spot for every side. It's well supported, but it cannot freely move. So when you round the channels of the nut, you might have 2 problems. One is if it's too loose, then it can rattle into the slot and not be well seated. If you narrow the slot to avoid that problem, then you can pinch the string into the slot, and then it buzzes because it moves in an awkward way. It's not well supported, but it's pinched. So the result normally is a certain kind of buzzing you get. So with the V shape, you avoid both while still making sure that the string is always well supported. Regarding the angle from the fingerboard side to the headstock side, I try to round the slope a little bit, so it's not a sharp angle in between the two different angles that I have here on the string and here. So it's not an in-between, it's slightly rounded. But especially on the 6th string, you have to put a bit of care when rounding it to make it a bit steeper on the back side, because the string is so thick and heavy that if you don't have enough of a breaking angle behind the breaking point, then the string can actually jump on top of the nut, again producing some kind of buzzing. And the last thing about the nut is one of the elements I use to keep the guitar in tune, so to speak, to compensate. So part of the compensation is done at the bridge end. The saddle is slightly tilted this way in order to compensate more on the basses, but I don't notch the saddle on the 3rd string, first of all because then it tends to make it sound different. By itself it already sounds different, the 3rd string, it's already problematic. If you take bone off on this side, it's already fairly thin, then you end up making it sound even more different than the other strings. So I don't do that. And in order to compensate better, especially on the 3rd string, I finish the compensation on the nut side. So the fingerboard, it's actually cut a bit short from the theoretical point it should be, about 0.4 millimeter. And then the nut is notched back on most of the string, but not on the 3rd string. So the net result is the 3rd string on this side, it's actually 0.4 of a millimeter shorter than the other strings. That helps tune it a little bit better, not just overall, but especially in this region. So when you play, for example, the E chord, if you play E major or E minor, so with G sharp or G normal, then if you don't do that, it's really difficult to tune the guitar in order to have the E major chord and E minor chord both fairly well tuned, because the 3rd string is too thick. So here in the first positions, you bend it more than, say, here. The angle you apply on the string, pressing it here, it's sharper to go down here than it is to when you press it, for example, here. The angle you change is much lower. So a less flexible string like the 3rd string cannot bend so sharply. So it bends more round, so making it a bit sharper than it would be. So you try to solve these small issues with these techniques. Having said that, obviously I suppose everybody knows by now the guitar cannot be in tune. So more generally speaking about the tuning of the guitar, it's a peculiar instrument in that it needs to be fairly well tempered, but for the way it is physically, cannot be equally tempered like a piano. So if you play note by note on any guitar, some notes are not gonna be exactly in tune with a piano, for example, or with the correct frequency of equal tempered instrument. The guitar cannot do that. The workaround nowadays, I've seen the most recent one is I don't remember the name, but it's actually a trademark. So the frets are not straight. So on every fret, the fret is a little bit forward and backwards on every string position. That can solve the tuning of the guitar only in theory, because you still use different strings. You still might want a different saddle height, and the frets themselves, they wear out with time. They are rounded, so you cannot control 100% where the string is actually vibrating from, and even how hard you press on the string when you play changes the pitch of the string itself. So it's like chasing a problem and finding others. So I don't see it as a problem that needs to be solved. The guitar is what it is, and it sounds like this because it's what it is. So again, I just said that I try to compensate a little bit better, of course, because you have positions where it becomes harder to make it sound pleasing and consistent every time. So I try to make it easier for the player to get it to where he wants it, and then I stop there. The guitar is what it is. For the neck and fingerboard, it's a very important topic for the way the guitar sounds, first of all, for the way it feels to the player, for how easy it is to play the instrument, or how difficult it can be at times. So there are several things that can help to make it more comfortable and easier to play, regardless of the string height. So with the same string height, you can have a more comfortable guitar or a much harder guitar to play. One element is the shape of the fingerboard. So the way you shape the fingerboard before installing the frets, and a few things help make it more comfortable. One obviously is a slight rounding of the fingerboard across the surface, so along the fret, not to leave it flat. So to keep it a bit rounder helps on the bar, to make it feel easier. Otherwise the finger cannot really make itself completely straight across. So if you have a completely straight surface, a fret line, then in order to press the center string, you would have to push this part of the finger more inside, and it's almost impossible. So this curve is crucial to make it feel more comfortable. One other thing is, since the string vibrates with a belly and not on a straight angled line, then if you were to make this line of the frets completely straight, then you would have to raise the string more in order to buzz less. In order to keep the string reasonably low and not buzz, it's very important to shape the fingerboard with a certain curve that follows the belly of the string. Especially in the first position, the string has a big amplitude of vibration. So for these notes to be clean without raising too much the saddle, it's important to have a shape coming down like this on this section of the neck. So this is also something important. You are able to not raise too much the action and still have a clean sounding instrument. And the other thing regarding the fingerboard that I think is quite important is to make it so in order to have a bit higher action on the basses than on the trebles, but not tilt the saddle on the bridge, then the fingerboard itself also has to have a certain tilt this way and or this way, depending on the heights you reach. So it's a bit difficult by the time you get to do this work, because all those parameters you have to balance them and get them to where you want them, and at the same time you find yourself planing a piece of ebony, and ebony is really hard. It dulls the blade of the plane very fast, so it's a frustrating process. You are chasing a result that is complex by itself, and the tools you use wear out very fast. So there's a slight tendency to try and keep it as it is at a certain point, get just close enough and give up. So it's one of those parts, and guitar making is full of those parts, where you just have to push yourself to just go one more step. And in this case specifically, this extra step or few steps, it's actually gonna make a tangible difference on the result you get in the end. It's not just aesthetics like the miters on the purfling or any other thing where you want to be extra careful to work well. In this case, the difference is actually very, very noticeable for the player in the end. Regarding the shape of the neck, most of my guitars are shaped the way I like, the way I feel it's more comfortable. So it's probably could be said a D shape. It's less round in this region, but it's still round, it's not flat at all. And then it blends with a bit of a sharper curve to the fingerboard. But I take great care in blending the last part of the neck with the fingerboard. So the fingerboard is not flat in this part. At least 1/4 or 1/3 of the fingerboard, it's already starting to turn. So only the upper part of the fingerboard is the original width, not the whole thickness of the fingerboard, especially like on a traditional guitar where you keep the fingerboard fairly thick, about 6.5, 7 millimeters. If you were to leave all of this wood flat for some reason, then the neck would feel chunkier and it would become much harder to blend in with a constant curving the whole shape. You either leave this part flatter and then make it very much curved on this section, or you would have to maybe change the dimension of it. So this blending with the fingerboard, it's something key for me to make it feel nice. Also, when you hold it, when you play, you don't really put your hand on this part of the neck, yet just holding the guitar and feeling how it is, this blending makes it feel just nicer and more natural to the hand. This is the normal design I use on Rosettes, the most common, and it's also a fairly classical design. So it's basically 3 mosaics, 2 on the outside that are the same zigzag pattern, and a turning motif in the center section, like a wood shaving or a spiral or whatever you want to see in it. All these motifs, you can find them throughout the history of the instrument. They're very common. Anytime you take these elements, I talked about it before, for the headstock and for the shape of the body. The important thing for me is to find a balance in the dimensions of the elements, both in the lines of the headstock, or in this case in the width of the rosette, how much separation you get between the outer mosaics and the center mosaic, different widths of the sections of the rosette. They make for a big change in the look of it, how heavy it feels, how light or thin or big, and the combination of dark and light part also makes a big difference. So whenever I develop a different rosette, first of all I try to come up with a basic design. After that it's a matter of perfecting it. So you end up making a first run of your basic design the way you think it might work, and you have to commit to it all the way to the end and see it on the finished guitar. There's no way to have a complete appreciation of how it works before you see it on the guitar. I make simulations in CAD programs, in Photoshop. I try to superimpose it on a guitar picture. I do all of that, but it does not give you the sensations you get on the finished instrument. Also, what is really difficult to tell beforehand is how it looks at different distances. Because if we consider this design, then we zoom in, we check what it is, and we can decide we like it or not based on a zooming of it. But you almost never see a guitar like that. So it's very important to see at different distances how it keeps looking. The further away you go, the more it looks one color. This color can be a light color, a dark color, or something in between. You can still get the impression of pattern vaguely from far away if the pattern is bigger than this. With this one, for example, once you reach 10-15 meters away, even if you have a good eyesight, it becomes very difficult. So this one looks more or less lighter tone than this, or something like this, a dark brown or something like that. So those things, the only way to really ascertain them is to make a few guitars and then evaluate it and decide. So for this rosette specifically, for example, I made probably 4 or 5 different runs with small modifications years ago, and now I've settled this design because it also became part of how I see the guitar. I made so many with this rosette that it just feels natural at this point. The way I treat the top, it's obviously a very important part of the instrument. So my way of looking at it is, for the most part, I've been working with a fairly traditional and fairly similar bracing pattern. It's a 5-strut bracing pattern for the spruce top. On the cedar top, I normally use 6 struts with just one more on the treble side, and also use the closing bars on the cedar. So spruce is simpler, cedar is a bit heavier braced. The basic reason for this difference is cedar just needs a bit more reinforcement. It's a weaker wood, so normally, not just me, but many people, you tend to leave it a bit thicker, and then it works well if it's a bit more supported. For spruce, this basic bracing has been working well in the last 21 years, so I've been trying different things, changing some elements, adding or taking away certain parts, different thicknesses, but overall the effect of changing it hasn't been very dramatic in my experience. It might be different for others. So what I've settled in is minimal modification to the structure of the bracing and concentrating a lot more on the wood itself. So in the end, it wasn't even a rational choice, it was just a matter of observation and trial and error and an empirical way of assessing the result. It's much more effective for me to control the way the soundboard is treated onto a fairly stable and controlled bracing pattern than to try many different bracing. Through the years, obviously, especially at the beginning, I tried many of the classical bracing from the famous makers, and overall, through the years, I was a bit surprised to see how little compared to my expectations the bracing was affecting the result and how much other elements were affecting the result. So for instance, something that is not talked about so much is the way just the shape of the top affects the character of the instrument. And trying different shapes through the years, there's more, then you can clearly see every shape has a definite character of its own. It doesn't mean that if you use a different bracing, it sounds the same one with the other. It means that the way it affects the character of the instrument is much bigger than what I would have thought. Instead, different bracing pattern comparatively were affecting the result much less. So I worried less and less about the bracing and more about other elements, the way you treat the top, the shape of the instrument. Regarding the bracing, it's obviously very important for the stability and shape of the instrument, so that's where I put that's what I worry about the bracing I use. So I evaluate bracing patterns more on how they affect the shape of the finished guitar than with the sound they give you. So if I want to get a specific result on sound, the first element I think about is the wood for the soundboard. Instead, on different models, when I change a model, I develop a new model, when I first think about the bracing, it is for the structure of the instrument more than the sound. Obviously, afterwards you have to fine-tune the way the bracing works, but if it sounds very good and the guitar is deforming too much through time or it's not stable, it doesn't really matter how good it sounds. It's not going to be stable through time. It's not going to be reliable to the player. It's going to be very difficult to treat it. As far as choosing the top and deciding what kind of wood to use, because obviously it's a key part of the result, as I was saying before and as any maker knows. Then, of course, I have my record from all the guitars I made, and I take notes about measures, weights, flexibility, resonances, and afterwards I also judge the result. So obviously I have a fairly clear idea about the kind of wood I prefer to work with, obviously, but at the same time wood changes from piece to piece, no matter what, no matter how much you choose it. It's impossible to replicate the piece you liked so much on the previous guitar. So also, if you get stuck on a certain idea of wood, then you might miss trying different woods and seeing what kind of results you can get out of different woods. That it's also a very interesting part. So I've been trying to use a fairly wide array of woods. I mean, they're always either spruce or cedar, but of fairly different kinds, and trying to check carefully, maybe making a run of 2-3 guitars, one or two with the wood I would normally use, and one maybe with a bear claw top or a top that felt a bit stiff or a little heavy, or maybe especially light, and trying to get a similar result out of those different woods for as much as I could. So controlling many parameters when I prepare the top, I can bring one top that by itself would be slightly different closer to the parameters I normally use, either making it a bit thinner or leaving it a bit thicker. This way I was surprised many times about how the result was very close between two guitars with a top that at the start felt quite different, and it gave me also quite a bit of confidence in being able to maintain very good consistency on the outcome of my instrument. Because otherwise, if you rely too much on a specific kind of wood, then you're trapped a little bit in the result you will get by being able to consistently find that specific kind of material. So instead, I believe you can actually bring woods that are not naturally so similar to behave in a very similar way. For the way I see the guitar, back and sides are of limited importance. Obviously, they contribute to the character of the instrument, to a certain kind of brilliance it might have or not, especially if you use very heavy woods like ziricote that I like to use a lot, or Brazilian rosewood, Madagascar, compared to the Indian rosewood that tends to be a bit less dense. But overall it's just a bit of color that you can get one way or another. As far as thicknesses, from what I've tried through the years, I haven't seen an advantage on lowering the thickness of back and sides. Actually the opposite. So when I tried parallel guitars, one with the normal thicknesses and one thinner, the thinner one was not the best one out of the lot. So in the end, since it's also, again, very important for the structure and stability of the instrument, I tend to leave it not very thick, but not specifically thin. So a back, for example, I leave it around 2.3 if it's Indian rosewood, and the sides start out about 2 millimeters. By the time I clean them and sand them, they will probably be only 1.9, not less than that. For the back, especially in Indian rosewood, that is not a very figured wood, I prefer to leave the back uninterrupted by the center purfling unless the customer specifically asks for it. So if you properly join the pieces and you check for the grain when you prepare the pieces, it can have, for my taste, a very pleasant look to it. It looks almost like a one-piece back, especially in Indian, because Indian tends to have a fairly even grain and it's not very much figured. So yeah, to my taste, a back like this, that is full and uninterrupted, just looks nice. And the bridge obviously is a key part because it's the first element between the string and the whole instrument. So acoustically is key in order to get the result you want. In my case, the design in size and dimension is also fairly traditional. I haven't tried crazy designs that I know do exist, but I'm not very much attracted by trying that. So it's 29 millimeters wide, 184 millimeter wide in this direction. What I have changed a little bit through the years is the width of the saddle. So I moved from a 2 millimeter saddle to a 2.3 millimeter saddle. I think it gives me a better result overall, and I tend to make it, I always make it with 2 holes per string. You can always tie only with one if you want, but the second one is there if you need it. Otherwise it's really difficult to add it afterwards. And to me it's just easier to tie the strings this way, even for players. And the sound you can get tying with 1 hole or 2 holes, it's actually slightly different. So that's also an option the player has. Other than trying different strings, you can also try to tie them differently and see how you prefer. Mm-hmm. In my experience from player to player, there are players that end up tying normally just because they prefer the way it works, and many others just keep tying them like this. So as far as weight, it's also very important. What I was talking about, the saddle applies also to the weight of the bridge. So both the saddle and the bridge, their mass, their density affects directly the way you transmit the different frequency from the strings where you produce them to the top, and the guitar where you amplify them. So better or worse is difficult to say, but you end up again trying to balance different things. So if you have a very heavy weight on the bridge, it might be helpful for something, maybe for sustain, to give you a longer sustain. A very lightweight bridge is probably quicker in response and might even be louder under certain circumstances, but how do you balance those things? You obviously want a loud guitar, but the sustain has to be there to a certain point. Conversely, if you have too much sustain and then it just maintains the notes too much and you have to dampen them, and you even lose volume because of that, then you're going obviously the wrong direction. But then you have to find the parameters where you work well with. Mm-hmm. It's the same as the soundboard, as I was saying before. Try to find the parameters that give you the result you want and that you're comfortable with, and try to work around those parameters. Then you can obviously try different things. So in my experience, this bridge, for example, is already a little bit on the heavy side, being about 25 grams finished. But I try not to use bridges that are below 23 or maybe 22 grams. So I would not go much heavier than this one, but I would not go much lighter than others. Maybe I saved a very light one, for example, for the very few flamenco guitars I make, because for that it's actually beneficial for the kind of sound you look for. Mm-hmm. But on a classical, to me, lighter is better. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. You lose too many things with a very light bridge. Other than the different elements of the guitar, above all, what's really important is the vision you develop through the years of the instrument itself, of your instrument. So by making one after the others, and through your basic idea of how the guitar is and should be, you slowly develop your idea of a guitar. And to me, it has been very important to stay in touch with this vision and try to get a clear understanding of the whole instrument and how everything works together. More than understanding, it's actually a feeling of it, because it's so complex that even the scientific studies on the guitar are not definitive on how it all works together. You can isolate elements and see how specifically the bridge works with the soundboard, or many other studies that have been carried out on the guitar, but to have a complete picture of what it is and why is it that works like this and how you want it to be, and be able to reach the result you envision. Those parts are the key parts of being a guitar maker, a luthier. In order for this to happen, it's just a matter of a very long journey that never ends. It only ends with the death of the maker, obviously, but otherwise it wouldn't have an ending point. And in order to get deeper and deeper into this, I found very useful to try to distance myself as least as possible from the instrument, so any step in the construction process I try to carry it out on a very direct and intimate way, and put myself in it as much as possible without fearing the risk of failure. I don't try to hide myself. I think it's very important, for as much as you fear failures when you launch yourself in something, try to work against these fears and be closer to the instrument. In less vague terms, it translates through more direct use of hand tools, and also the construction techniques try to use less and less jigs, fixtures, or anything in between myself, my movements, and the instrument. It translates on my side on a better understanding of what it is, because we are having a deeper relationship throughout the construction process. And on the instrument side, it translates into having more of myself in the instrument. And myself in very practical terms, not my mind, but my arms, my hands. There's especially in bowed instrument luthery, you use the term the hand of the maker, meaning the character of the maker translated on his instruments. And you can see it, you can codify it, the way the scroll on the violin is made. It depends on the hand of the artisan. Well, it's literal terms. So these hands with these tools, when I shape part of the instrument, I impart my way of doing this. And so it's not a jig, it's not a template that I check constantly and take small shavings off until it's perfectly like that. So between every guitar, they might have very slight differences if you measure them very strictly, but they will be more similar in the intent, in the same group. So they will all have my character, and that's a key part of the artisan work. This approach to guitar making also enables you to have more consistency, because being so close to the piece and to the whole instrument the whole time, the closer you are physically through the process, the more the instrument will be similar to each other. And you can check that the opposite way, and that is making the same instrument by different people, even in the same workshop. I had apprentices in the workshop here making the same guitar I make, with the same wood, same tools, same everything, and the result is much different.